We're going to address the topic of metal and change through the Japanese media trope of Henshin, meaning transformation or metamorphosis. The scenes in which Usagi becomes Sailor Moon, for example, or teens with attitude become Power Rangers, are called Henshin scenes. They're heavily associated with a power-up in superhero media, but can also be scenes in which someone's suppressed true nature is revealed. We're going to talk about the role of metal music in Henshin representations in two Japanese television programs.
Studies have shown that listeners, particularly listeners who are unfamiliar with metal music, associate the genre with anger. But how does this relate to empowerment? And what are the implications of connecting empowerment to metal music's supposed angry sounds in television that's reaching audiences outside of the metal scene? Instead of looking at the representation of metal musicians in television shows like Detroit Metal City, we've shifted our focus to two programs in which the sounds of metal are central to their representation of transformation and empowerment through anger. Agretsuko and Kamen Rider.
Anger carries very different connotations depending on context, and gender and age play a role in its reception. Television offers a context for anger and power through its narrative as well as through an affective experience shared by its audience by dint of sound design. In the shows we're looking at, metal connotes positive change in the form of empowerment and self-expression within the larger structures in which the subject is bound. Anger and power are brought together and, through the structure of the writing, become coded as righteous anger. The target audience for both of these shows consists of two subjugated groups who have historically been placed together in legal as well as cultural terms, women and children. Agoretsuko addresses the experiences of young female office workers in contemporary Japan. Kamen Rider, our second example, is part of a superhero franchise that has been running since 1971, with a core audience of 2 to 8-year-old children. But Kamen Rider is notable for adopting a dual address that capitalizes on the popularity of the show with mothers who co-view with their children. So considering these audience positions, we believe it's worth thinking about the role of an affective experience of power achieved through heaviness in television sound design.
Writing on extreme vocal production, Eric Smilek argues that the bestial sounds we culturally associate with the demonic in metal music are found in nature, and that by creating sound with the ventricular folds and then forming it through an extended vocal tract, human extreme vocalists are producing sounds in the same way as animals when they try to give an impression of greater size, for instance, during a fight or mating season. Now, Smilek's work goes into immense technical detail that's not quite relevant for this paper, but the principle of a zoological basis for the psychoacoustic effect of size and power in extreme metal vocals is tantalizing. Along with other research on psychoacoustic features of heaviness in metal, it highlights the possible dual nature of metal in television as a genre-based cultural signifier, as well as a means of creating a more universal effect of size and power. We're going to start by looking at a story about an office worker, Red Panda, who voices her frustrations using bestial extreme metal vocals.
Sanrio's Agretsuko 2016 to 2018 is an animated series on Netflix that features a cute red panda called Letsuko, who uses what the program calls death voice or growling, complete with a death metal track accompanying the vocals, to express the anger and frustration that builds up during her days working as a low-ranking young woman in the sexist and exploitative environment of a Japanese office. Although Letsuko doesn't change into a different animal or into a superhero, we argue that she does henshin. Corpse paint appears on her face, and the kanji for rage, retsu, appears on her forehead while she sings. Deborah Ochi has described this kanji as Retsuko's henshin mark. And in this case, the henshin is revealing the true feelings that she has to suppress in order to comply with both corporate culture and gendered behavioral expectations. Robertson, Hambleton, and Hiramoto read Letsuko's anger as a transgressive rage, but see it as sympathizing with women's struggles, but endorsing few new avenues for female identities, speech, and representation in contemporary Japan. This Sanryo-ized transgression, they argue, Endorses a little rebellion, but only if you're sure to go back to work when you are done. In some ways, this conclusion resembles Rosemary Hill's work on gender, in which interview data suggests that metal remains a patriarchal site in production and consumption, but that neoliberal feminism enables women to make sense of their experiences as empowering.
When constructed as a violent and destructive emotion, anger does not bring on the revolution in this show, just as women performing and enjoying metal music has not yet shaken the patriarchal foundations of society. But if we view anger not as a destructive emotion, but as a generative emotion, a different picture starts to emerge. Rosemary Hill has explored the idea that metal can be a queerscape, one that allows women to feel a freedom, however temporary, from the constraints of femininity. This respite is fleeting and only relative to the pervasive sexism in society as a whole, but, as Hill argues, there is still a chance to step outside the strictures of the dominant idea of femininity and to sometimes experience a feeling of genderlessness. In the context of a Japanese fictional television narrative, there are some additional considerations at play, however. Horton specifically highlights the presence of girlish femininity in the Japanese scene, perhaps best exemplified by baby metal. Retsuko is not part of a metal scene for the first few seasons, but she does host a popular YouTube channel where she teaches other women how to sing in death voice. The community that Retsuko eventually finds through her music is an entirely female one. Rather than a temporary step away from femininity into genderlessness, for instance, Retsuko's character progression shows her gradually breaking down the barrier between her transgressive rage and her performance of femininity, and this culminates in her using her role as a lead singer of an idol group as a springboard for her campaign to run for parliament. She does this in direct opposition to the patriarchal system that persists in contemporary Japan of sons inheriting their father's seats in government. Retsuko is empowered not to tear down the system, but to articulate an alternative through the creation of a community of women. She does this by leveraging the aesthetic agency of metal. Now, Denora, from whom I took that term, notes that listening to or remembering metal music serves as a means of putting actors in touch with capacities, reminding them of accomplished identities, which in turn fuels the ongoing projection of identity from past into future. Building on this, Patterson points out that the aesthetic agency of metal might also include an ability to speak your truth with impunity. In Agretsuko, heaviness provides an additional language in which to feel and through which to articulate self-identity silenced by social norms. Retsuko's initially hidden and private death voice develops into the foundation for a community of women united by their expressions of anger and desire for change. The henshin that Retsuko undergoes when growling, symbolized by the character for rage on her forehead, is a transformation that links anger, metal, and change. In the first season, Retsuko's anger is largely directionless. She wishes that her chauvinistic boss would be struck by lightning, but she doesn't actually stand up to him. As the series progresses, however, Retsuko begins to draw on the rage she expresses through growling to be more assertive in her everyday life. Having practiced speaking her truth in the privacy of the karaoke booth, she develops the confidence to speak her truth to power in the world outside. Retsuko's empowerment develops in concentric circles across the seasons, beginning with changes to her work environment and then to communities beyond work and culminating in a shot at national politics. Practicing anger through extreme death voice allows the character to express anger at injustice that motivates action for change in the plot of Agretsuko. But what are the implications of incorporating heavy effects into children's television programming, for instance? And how might that relate to the generative use of righteous anger as a catalyst for change? Childhood is a temporary state, but children nevertheless do represent a subjugated group, not least in terms of bodily autonomy, freedom of movement, and the regulation of emotions, particularly emotions like anger.
The Henshin or transformation scene is a key part of children's superhero franchise Kamen Rider, through which the show marks a character's transformation from a regular person into a superhero. Yet surprisingly for a show written for such a young audience, these superhero stories are less about good versus evil than they are about the dynamics of power. Although the medium is highly stylized to gain and keep the interest of a child audience, the empowerment of the Henshin transformation is not a translation of might makes right, but rather expresses that right makes might within the show. And it draws extensively on melodrama as a means to express moral judgment. So sound and music, including metal music, combine with movement to express righteous anger in a way that is accessible and reenactable for children and their mothers in the process. In Kamen Rider, the specific form of the superhero, including costume and abilities, is indicated by the Henshin theme that plays during the transformation scene. The level of power is indicated by the sounds, so weapons and even specific attacks have their own themes that can be integrated into play, as the props used in the show are actually faithful reproductions of the tie-in merchandise, which can play these oral cues. We're going to share an example from 2008's Kamen Rider Kiva. This is the first transformation scene.
キバット
おうよっしゃ気張っていくぜキャブ
変身
The music used in Kamen Rider is part of its sonic world building, and it reflects some of the key characteristics of heaviness that have been identified in metal studies research, including distortion, sonic weight, size and density, clarity and punch, loudness, and extremity.
The song Ultimate Darkness from the 2000 and 2000 to 2001 series Kamen Rider Kuga is a really good example of this. We're going to play this now. Thanks, Sophie. So this song is clearly metal. It has elements of heaviness from downtuning, distortion in the organ and guitars to punch sonic density, particularly around 2.5 minutes into the piece, and of course extreme metal vocals. But the use of metal as a genre here is not symbolically loaded itself. This is not presented explicitly as being a metal song for the sake of it being a metal song. Instead, it's used to express the Gothic style of the series, and it's integrated into the world building. There's a thematic interplay of the demonic and the divine that's implied by the use of organ. Of organ, the growl, and then at the end of the piece, there's also a voice soprano. The piece also invokes the lacrimosa from Mozart's Requiem in its introduction. Now, all of these elements are at home in metal's music's history, but they are also in the broader tradition of the Gothic that's adapted to this specific context. Protracted exploration of various moral quandaries surrounding might and justice drive the Kamen Rider plots, and Cougar, for instance, uses a gothic mode that consistently blurs the line between monster and hero. The growling in this piece, for instance, is in Gorongi, an imaginary language that is used by the monsters. This language is associated with a transformation form that's used by both hero and monster on screen, though. So rather than an empowerment that is only about a previously weak hero being empowered, the show explores the idea that the difference between monster and hero is for whom they wield that power.
But the sonic affect of heaviness, with its relationship to size and power, feed into the franchise's use of transformation, not to assert, as we said earlier, might makes right, but rather that right makes might. And this occurs when the hero is confronted with an unforgivable transgression. It says the word yurusan, literally meaning unforgivable, but having the broader implication of a line having been crossed that can no longer be ignored. The word yurusan is used in older media, including literature, to signify the climax of a kanzen choaku plot, that is, the rewarding of good and the punishment of evil. So in Kamen Rider, the protagonist will experience emotional pain, usually by witnessing the suffering of someone more vulnerable, utter the word yurusan, and then gain additional strength, a new technique or weapon, or even a new Henshin suit. The utterance yurusan marks the moment when righteous anger creates transformative power. And in this context, the use of sonic heaviness is less about the genre of metal than the effects of the size and the power that it brings. And these are key to the transformation of characters as they morph into stronger forms through powerful feelings, and through those feelings, cast moral judgment in the tradition of melodrama. And we'll show an example from Kamen Rider RX, which is from 1988.
の命を引っ張るとは RX 地獄へ落ちろ。
その時不思議なことが起こった。デスガロンの攻撃を受け死を覚悟した RX であったが、悲しみの涙が RX の秘められた再生能力を生き生きと発動させたのである。
何者だお前は。俺はかましみの王子 RX ロボライダー。
So we've argued elsewhere that Kamen Rider is a program in the melodramatic mode, following Gledhill's definition of the mode as heteroglossic, combining music, music-like speech, spectacular visuals, gesture, and choreography that carries emotion. But more importantly, it embodies and enacts drama and personal crisis, and this crisis is used to assert a moral standpoint. While Henshin scenes happen in every episode of Kamen Rider, we argue that the Yurusan subcategory of the Henshin scene meets the definition of a sensation scene. So in melodrama, Keegan argues, sensation scenes set up a distinctive dialectic between moral significance and an excess of bodily expression aimed directly at the production of affect. The sensation scene thus exemplifies the manner in which melodrama seeks to achieve moral clarity through physical exaggerations that produce an emotive response, both diegetically inside the story and in the audience watching it.
There's a substantial amount of research on how emotions like empathy can be practiced and learnt through television. Cohen et al. Take this further, though, and argue that most people are bystanders rather than heroes in high-stakes situations because they're out of practice, and that imagining oneself behaving heroically in such situations might be considered a form of training that could alter future behavior. This is the basic idea that hero stories can serve as a nourishing catalyst for transformative change, to quote Allison et al. Here. So could it be that in the case that children who are watching Kamen Rider are practicing for their own Yura-san moment? Are they perhaps rehearsing the feeling of seeing a red line and refusing to remain silent? It is significant that the empowerment of heaviness is offered here to relatively young characters and aimed at a very young child audience. Not as an end state, though, to be positioned in the future when they're adults, but as an integral part of the process of transformation. Righteous anger is not an emotion that adults generally seek to cultivate in young children, yet the kind of anger represented by the utterance Yura-san is, we believe, an important intermediary step between feeling empathy and taking action. The desire to see a stake driven through the heart of neoliberal patriarchal systems represented on screen is an undeniable one and an understandable one, but it is not all that anger can do, and it's not all that metal can do. In Agretso and Kamen Rider, metal signifies a change that makes change. It shows how this change can spill out and empower the audience to first feel change and then make it. Thanks so much for listening.